In the previous episode, we spoke about the ideas in the books the Renaissance humanists were so keen on reading and the effect these ideas had on Western society. In this episode, we'll be discussing how the movable type printing technology, which its inventor Johannes Gutenberg used to print his famous 42-line Bible in the 1450s, radically transformed Western society. Welcome to Depth History, where we talk about how the human condition created and creates the human condition. At first glance, it might not seem that the new printing technology would have changed very much. After all, there were books before the Gutenberg Bible, and there were books after the Gutenberg Bible. So all that changed was that books became cheaper, right? No, wrong. So much changed. Printing enabled and created the modern world. But before we talk about the transition from handwritten manuscripts to printed books, and not only books were printed, let's talk for a moment about oral cultures, where there is no writing. A society or culture can survive only if it can pass on to the next generation the knowledge that has enabled it to survive this far. If there is no place outside a person's mind where knowledge can be stored and from which it can be retrieved, then everything a young person needs to learn, how to fight, hunt, plant, cook, the group's genealogy, its religious beliefs, etc., all knowledge must be learned in face-to-face encounters with another person, and it all has to be memorized because it's not possible to take notes. It's difficult for 21st century modern people to imagine a world like that, where nothing can be written down, nothing can be looked up, and everything has to be memorized. Writing provides that place outside a person's mind where knowledge can be stored and from which it can be retrieved. Alphabetic writing, not the first type of writing, but today the most widespread, was invented in what is now Lebanon around 1500 BCE, and was adapted by different peoples in the area to their own languages, including Israelites and Greeks, and used by the ruling classes to maintain the political and religious power structures, and by merchants to manage the growing trade networks. More than any other single invention, writing has transformed human consciousness. While we think of writing as one of the most important and useful inventions of all times, there were other voices. Plato's Socrates declared that writing produces forgetfulness in the minds of those who learn to use it, because they will not practice their memory and will be for the most part ignorant and hard to get along with, since they are not wise, but only appear to be wise. It's interesting that he says, hard to get along with. St. Paul, in his epistle to the Corinthians, was also critical of the written word, saying, the letter kills, but the spirit gives life. In Judaism too, the oral law, the Mishnah and the Talmud, takes precedence over and has made numerous changes to the written law, the Bible. In Hindu scripture, reliance on writing was seen as crippling and not giving true control over linguistic content. Knowledge in a book is money in another's hand. Note that all of these warnings about the danger of the written word have come down to us in writing. Instead of expensive and laboriously produced unique manuscripts, each one with errors different from all other manuscripts of the same text, printing made it possible to produce hundreds of inexpensive, identical copies, each one with the same errors. A famous example of this is the so-called Wicked Bible of 1632, where the seventh commandment was rendered as, "Thou shalt commit adultery." By 1500, only 50 years after Gutenberg's invention, printing workshops, more than 1,000 of them, had been established in every important city in Europe. Printing created a completely new industry, almost from nothing, out of nowhere, employing thousands of skilled craftsmen to manufacture and distribute its products. The first assembly line was not one which produced stoves or shoes or weaponry, but one which produced the printed book. It's not a coincidence that within printing's first century there occurred the Protestant Reformation in 1517, the splintering of a united Christendom into numerous warring sects, warring both ideologically and literally, real wars with many thousands of dead. The Copernican Revolution in 1543, the displacement of the Earth from the center of the universe and by implication of mankind from the center of God's creation, and the beginnings of what became known as the Scientific Revolution. The publication of utopias, beginning with Thomas More's Utopia in 1516, descriptions of far-off, perfect societies in which all of mankind's problems had been overcome, where everyone was happy, and voicing for the first time the sacrilegious idea that the mythical Golden Age was not in the distant past, but in a future that mankind could, by its own efforts, bring about. None of these developments would have been possible without printing. After Martin Luther posted his 95 Theses on the door of the chapel at Wittenberg in 1517, the act that set in motion the Protestant Reformation, they were quickly translated into German, summarized, printed, and within only 2 weeks were distributed everywhere in Germany, and within a month all over Europe. The Church had repeatedly declared as a heretic anyone who advocated translating the Bible into the vernacular languages, as the Englishman John Wycliffe and the Czech Jan Hus and Luther had all done. In 1415, at the Council of Constance, the Church burned Hus at the stake and had Wycliffe's bones dug up and burned and dumped in a river. A century later, Luther succeeded where the others had failed, not only because he was protected by some German princes, but also because the new technology of printing, which hadn't been available to Wycliffe or Hus, enabled him to spread his message and his Bible translation far and wide. Luther later wrote, "I have hitherto taught and held all the opinions of Hus without knowing it. We are all of us Hussites without knowing it." In 1522, the first 3,000 copies of Luther's translation of the New Testament sold out in only a few weeks. In the 40 years between 1534 and 1574, over 100,000 copies of Luther's Bible were printed and could be found in almost every German-speaking Protestant's home. Printing removed the monopoly of the elites, especially churchmen, on reading and writing. It initiated a virtuous cycle of more people reading, more people wanting to learn how to read, more people buying books, etc. If everyone had the same access to book learning, how could the rigid hierarchical structure of European society be justified? If everyone could now read the Bible in their own language, how could the Church's monopoly on theological interpretation be justified? Luther spoke of the general priesthood of all baptized Christians, meaning there was no spiritual divide between priests and laity. By shifting authority away from the Church to the individual believer, Luther unwittingly advanced democratic ideas. Scholars no longer had to wander from monastery to monastery, from cathedral to cathedral, from city to city, to consult the books they needed. Instead, the books came to them. The Complutensian Polyglot of 1517 was one of the first Bibles to show the text in the different biblical languages. It would have been quite impossible to produce a Bible like this before printing. As more ancient philosophical works became available, not only in their original languages, but also in translation, the atheistic, Hellenistic philosophies of Stoicism, skepticism, and Epicureanism slowly infiltrated the European consciousness and exerted massive influence on political philosophies and the sciences. We'll explore this point in detail in upcoming videos, so please subscribe so that you won't miss them. Also, for the first time, diagrams and tables could be accurately reproduced. Before printing, most people had never seen an accurate diagram. Now everyone could see maps, charts, tables, and mathematical formulae that presented data in accessible and understandable form. Detailed, comprehensive astronomical tables enabled astronomers to devote more time to their own observations and research. Print was also a major factor in the development of the sense of personal privacy that marks modern society. It produced books smaller and more portable than those common in the manuscript culture, setting the stage psychologically for solo reading in a quiet corner, and eventually for completely silent reading. In manuscript culture, and hence in early print culture, reading had tended to be a social activity, one person reading to a group. Printing made it possible for anyone, including women of all classes, to publish books of their own. Anyone with some money could publish a book, and many did. Novels, religious works, poetry, a genre especially favored by upper-class women, accounts of travel to the newly discovered lands across the sea, dictionaries, and, of course, pornography. Printing standardized vernacular languages. In 17th century France, there were more than 20 dialects spoken in the different regions. Obviously, printing every book in every dialect was not feasible, and it was the printer who decided on a dialect that would in practice become the standard vernacular. Usually, this turned out to be the dialect of the capital city, London or Paris, eventually making it easier for people from different parts of a country to communicate. News spread quickly as never before. In 1503 and 1505, 2 booklets were published under Amerigo Vespucci's name, containing colorful descriptions of his 1497 and 1504 voyages to the New World, according to some scholars, likely exaggerated and or creatively embellished. Both booklets were very popular and were instrumental in the New World being named America. Scholarly journals such as Pierre Bayle's French-language Journal of Literary Criticism, News from the Republic of Letters, was one of the first of its kind and was distributed all over Europe. The first issue of the Journal of the Learned, the first journal devoted to science, appeared in Paris in January 1665. It was followed a few months later by the first issue of the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society. Both journals are still published today. These journals and many others kept scholars and scientists across Europe up to date on developments in their fields and enabled them to collaborate on joint projects. It didn't take long for the powers that be, church and princes, to understand the dangers of a free press. In 1535, King Francis I of France declared the printing of any and all books a capital offense, but the law was never enforced. In 1560, the Catholic Church established its Index of Forbidden Books, a list of books that Catholics were forbidden to read, which was abolished only in 1966. Printing created modern Western society. So much of what we take for granted about modern Western society would not have been possible without printing. There would be no universal public education, no democracy, no modern science, no human rights, no freedom of expression, no freedom of religion, no public health, no impartial courts. Slavery would still exist. Women would still be treated more like property than human beings. Thousands would be executed every year in the most cruel ways, and perhaps worst of all, no hope for a better future. Please join me in the next episode, where we'll talk about why the world's other civilized societies, Islam and China, avoided the fate of the West, for better or for worse, and for future episodes, where we'll be examining in detail individual areas like the abolition of slavery, the rise of religious skepticism and disbelief, human rights, women's rights, and others. By the way, if you enjoyed this video, please click the like icon, subscribe, and ring the bell, so you'll be notified of new videos as soon as they come out. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.